everybody, it's Amy from Northwoods Studio, and today we're talking about the 3 watercolor techniques that I use the most often in my art and that every beginner watercolor artist should know. We'll be using this piece right here. This is going to be footage from my first Patreon mixed media tutorial. It's watercolor, colored pencil, and gouache. And if you'd like to follow along and do the whole Patreon video, everything's $4 a month. I only have the 1 tier. And there will be a reference photo, my line drawing if you don't feel like sketching out your own drawing, and also my materials list down to the actual colors of the watercolor and colored pencils. So if you would like to join us, we'd more than love to have you, and if not, stay right here on YouTube and I will show you again how I used watercolor to do the base layer of this piece. So come on in and let's get creating. Okay, so we're gonna start with a wet into wet wash. So we're gonna start by wetting our whole paper with some clean water. Okay, so once your paper is thoroughly wetted, we are going to do a background, and we're gonna start with some pretty light washes of color, and I would like to be able to see my sketch through here. So I'm going to layer it pretty lightly. So here I've wet my whole paper and I'm dropping the pigments into the wet paper, which is wet into wet. In a minute, after this dries, I'm going to wet just one individual leaf and then drop pigment into the wet leaf, which is also wet into wet, but a slightly different application. And the first thing I'm going to do is take some nice clean water and I'm going to wet the leaf that I'm going to work on. So I generally use wet into wet if I'm working on a background or something that's not going to be super detailed. The more detailed something needs to be for me, the more likely I am to work wet into dry or to do glazes. And the less detailed something needs to be, the more likely I am to do a wet into wet, which is what we're going to do here now. If you're looking for a blurry, slightly out of focus background, wet into wet is the way to go. It also is good when I'm doing like these leaves here. I can get a variation in color on the leaves without having to put in too much detail, which could make it look too crisp and bring it forward into the painting foreground. Just keep everything nice and loose and kind of misty looking, because these are in the background. These are not our foreground leaves, so we don't want them too detailed or they'll take away too much attention from our main part of our painting here. I'm more of a realistic, detailed artist. People who do loose watercolor sometimes will do the entire painting as wet into wet. I generally only use it in the beginning stages of my painting for things that are in the background or to put in a base layer of color on something, like my mouse up in the corner there. And that's true whether I'm working just in watercolors or whether I'm planning to move on and make it a full mixed media piece with other mediums mixed in. This is the mix again. And I'm just dropping some in and letting it go where it wants to so that these look kind of faded and off in the distance. We don't want anything really detailed that'll distract too much from the rest of the painting. Wet into wet with watercolor is really where you see the magic of watercolor. There's a lot that you can learn about wet into wet. Like, for example, the more pigment you put into an area of lesser pigment, the more it'll spread. If the area has lots of pigment already and you drop some pigment in, it won't spread very much. There's lots of little details like that you can learn, but it's just a beautiful, magical, unpredictable way to paint, and it just makes some very beautiful effects. When you're working wet into wet, there's other things you can do as well to increase those effects, like sprinkling salt in or putting crumpled saran wrap on top of your painting and let it dry. I could do some tutorials on that. They make some really cool background effects, but it's really where the magic of watercolor shines. It's just, you can't recreate it with any other medium. Just the way the paint spreads and the gorgeous luminous quality, and especially if you're using transparent watercolors, it just has a luminous quality that you can't recreate with anything. I think the closest I've ever found is oil paints, but again, that's a whole different medium and it's not at all the same as watercolor, which is really special. Okay, you guys, so now we're on to our real full second layer now. I'm going to switch to my Neptune Zero brush here, and the same color we were just using for the mouse. I'm going to test it out around these pips here. I'm carrying it up a little bit higher than you would think from looking at the photo, because this isn't going to be the darkest dark here. This is like the shading coming up from it, and we will come back in with the colored pencils to do the darkest dark. So wet and to dry is really where you get all the details that you want to do in your painting. If I wasn't planning to make this piece a mixed media piece, this would be where most of my time went, getting all the little details. It is time consuming and it can be hard with watercolor because it still is unpredictable, although not as much as wet into wet. If I was doing this as a pure watercolor, I would be going along and softening the edges as I went, like I was doing on the mouse just a second ago. But since we're going to be going over this with colored pencil and gouache, it doesn't really matter. There's a little bit of feathering going on here. If you ever do have a piece of watercolor paper, somebody on YouTube asked me about that, about losing the sizing on the watercolor paper. If you ever do have that happen, you don't have to throw that watercolor paper out. You can buy, I think it's Holben makes a watercolor sizing liquid that you can brush on the paper to save it. And then, of course, Daniel Smith has their transparent watercolor ground, which you can use as well. I actually do think I'm going to soften these a little bit. So don't throw your watercolor paper out if that happens. You can save it by putting either of those two things on there. And I'm sure there's other brands that make other things, but those are the two that I've used to save the paper. The key to doing wet into dry for your details is making sure that your brush is really just damp with your pigment and water mixture and not very wet, so that you don't get blobs of color and liquid on your paper that you can't control. Also, if you're painting with wet onto dry, it's a possibility that you might get some very hard edges. To fix that, while your paint is still wet, you want to clean your brush very good in clean water and then dab it on your paper towel so it's just damp, and then very gently rub it along the edge of the paint that you want to soften. The extra clear liquid will dilute with the paint and make a much softer, more diffused edge instead of having a hard edge that you may not want later on in your painting. So I'm just glazing some of this darker color along in here. And again, we're going to soften the edge of this. So I didn't do a ton of glazing in this painting, but what glazing is where you want to change, like I said, the tone or the depth or the shadows of a piece. So here I'm glazing a light blue over this whole bottom portion of this piece. I felt like it was too warm on this lower part, so I am glazing some light blue over it to cool it down a little and to push it farther back into the background, like we talked about in my color theory video, which I can link below. I also used the glazing for some of the shadows on the berries. So like the shadow side, I glazed a darker purpley blue along some of the berries to create shadows. And I also glazed a little color along the back of the mouse to create some depth to his body there, and around the hind leg and the tail. I think I also did a little bit of glazing along the shadow side of the stem. I'm pretty sure I did. So, you know, like I said, you can push things farther into the background by glazing blue right over it. And I don't know if you just saw that, but I was glazing some blue over the blackberries themselves just to give them a more cohesive tone. So they sort of all looked like they belonged together on the same bush, and there weren't some berries that looked like they should be somewhere else. Okay, everybody, it's tape peel time, my favorite part. And the last one. Okay, you guys, so those are the 3 watercolor techniques that I think every beginner should know. If you would like to do this whole tutorial with me, feel free to head on over to my Patreon. Everything is just $4, and there's only 1 tier, so it's, I think, pretty inexpensive, and I had a lot of fun making this, and I hope to see you over on my Patreon. But if not, I love your support here as well. Every view and like and subscribe helps support my channel, and I appreciate them all so very much, no matter where you're following me. And until next time, happy creating!